Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Monday, May 4th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. It's Public Service Recognition Week. All week, we're focused on the people who keep federal work moving, how policy turns into operations, where the pressure points are, and what federal employees are navigating right now. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, in government, offering your best professional advice doesn't guarantee it will be taken, especially when leaders choose another path. Plus, Congress already strips pensions for some crimes. A new bill would expand the list. Those stories and much more ahead on this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. More than 100 Environmental Protection Agency employees were disciplined last year after signing a declaration of dissent. Many of those employees are now pursuing formal legal remedies, alleging unlawful retaliation. Here with the latest is Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Terry.
A year seems like a long, long time ago in our memories. How did this situation start?
This all started last summer when we had actually more than 600 EPA employees who signed this public declaration of dissent, as they called it. And it was a public letter that criticized EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin's policies at the agency and was raising concerns that Trump administration's leadership at EPA was reversing scientific progress, undermining public trust, and many, many other issues listed in this letter. After it was published, EPA leadership quickly launched an investigation into the employees who had been named in the letter. So by about last fall, it ended up that there were essentially three different groups of discipline for these employees who had signed the letter. Some received proposed termination notices, others, probationary employees, were outright fired, and then others were put on 2-week suspensions without pay. Many of these employees have been taking legal action over the last several months against EPA leadership as a result of this. They're now represented by the Government Accountability Project and Lawyers for Good Government. And I spoke recently with David Seid, who is counsel at the Government Accountability Project.
I think they're vitally important because employees do have rights, constitutional rights, statutory rights, whistleblower rights. We're zealously representing them because they've been wronged, and we think they should be vindicated because that's what the law and the Constitution expects.
Drew, what are the allegations at the core of the employee's case?
These generally fall into two buckets. One is that they're alleging violations of the employee's First Amendment rights. And then the second is federal whistleblower protection laws. They believe there were violations there. The First Amendment issue is pretty straightforward. They simply believe that as individuals, they have the right to speak up in their personal capacity. And then as for the alleged violations of federal whistleblower laws, if we look at what those laws are designed to do is protect employees from retaliation when they report suspected wrongdoing. And reports are considered protected by whistleblower laws when they involve a legal violation, gross waste of funds, gross mismanagement, abuse of authority, or a danger to public health and safety. So the lawyers for these EPA employees say that the declaration of dissent that they signed has all of those elements in it, and therefore it should be considered a protected disclosure under whistleblower laws. Those can also generally be disclosed or made public if there's not information contained in them that's prohibited by law from being released. So there's another argument there for, it's okay for this to be made public as well. And it was published online.
There's already a separate case on this at the Merit Systems Protection Board. Why do we have these two separate actions?
This is because there's a difference in how employees were disciplined as a result of the letter. Employees who were fired or terminated are dealing with that case at the Merit Systems Protection Board. They argue their terminations were a form of retaliation, again, for similar reasons as these other bucket of employees as well. But the ones that are going to the Office of Special Counsel now, which is the employees who were suspended for 2 weeks without pay last year, that level of penalty doesn't meet the requirements for filing a case at the MSPB. MSPB in most instances only handles disputes if there was a suspension that lasted for longer than 14 days. So if you're only going up to that 14-day threshold, then you wouldn't be able to file with MSPB. Therefore, they're turning to the Office of Special Counsel. Ultimately, this is two separate cases with very similar allegations and coming from the same group of EPA employees and both looking for the same end result here. And David Seid, again, from the Government Accountability Project, explains a little bit more about why they're going to OSC.
These folks were disciplined for exactly 14 days, so they were under the threshold. So these are more cases, same topic, same issues, but it's to get at a group that was overlooked. We're providing a vehicle for those people to have their rights vindicated too.
Drew, what is the status of these complaints and what are the next steps?
So far, there have been 15 complaints that were filed with the Office of Special Counsel. It's not clear whether those complaints yet are being investigated or what OSC's position is on these. But the lawyers for these EPA employees say that many more complaints are going to be filed pretty soon here at OSC. And they're seeking relief for these EPA employees, essentially providing them back pay, removing or scrubbing their records of the suspensions from last year, allowing them, if they miss out on a promotion or a raise as a result of the suspension, to be made whole for that. And I spoke also with Justin Chen, who's president of Council 238 at the American Federation of Government Employees, and just his stance and the union's stance on these issues here.
Our hope is that the Office of Special Counsel does their job and investigates the issue and, finds favor for our members. If the agency and management knows what's best, they should be providing restitution for these members. They should be paid back for all their damages, at the very least restore everything that they lost during the course of their suspensions, clear their records, and apologize to them.
Drew, there were other letters of dissent that came out around the same time, FEMA, NIH, some others. Do you think that these cases are going to be precedent-setting across the board?
It's possible. And there was actually just recently some news, I believe, that some of the FEMA employees who signed that letter were reinstated recently. So it's possible to see similar actions happening across these different agencies. It's absolutely a pattern. It's not just EPA on its own. But, I think there is kind of this pattern where you have employees who are exercising First Amendment rights, as is their belief, and, having the Trump administration push back. So some of these cases are still unclear in the outcomes, but definitely a pattern here.
That's Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Terry.
You can find her full story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, Congress already strips pensions for some crimes. A new bill would expand the list. This is The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.
Tune in Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. for the Innovation in Government Show, sponsored by Carasoft. Hear from the industry leaders advancing the technologies shaping how agencies modernize secure operations and deliver better services. Innovation in Government covers what is changing now, what is working from cybersecurity and cloud to data, AI, and emerging technologies. Listen to Innovation in Government, Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. on Federal News Network. Search Innovation in Government.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Under current law, members of Congress convicted of certain corruption offenses can forfeit their pensions, while other serious misconduct is treated differently. A bipartisan bill aims to close those gaps by including violent crimes and sexual misconduct involving staff. Supporters say the goal is accountability, not punishment by press release. Congressman Suhas Subramaniam, who co-sponsored the bill, joins me now. Congressman Subramaniam, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
You and your colleagues in the House have recently introduced a bill, a bipartisan bill, the Congressional Pension Integrity Act. I'm going to wager that congressional pensions are not something the average American thinks about on a daily basis. So could I ask you to start, before we dig into the bill, giving us a quick description about how the process works?
Well, when you're in Congress for long enough, you are eligible for a pension when you retire. That amount depends on how long you serve in Congress. What I learned recently is that when you commit a crime or violate the rules in Congress and retire, you still get that pension. And with very few exceptions, that pension is not taken away from you, even if you commit a crime or break the rules. So the idea behind this bill was to make sure that the taxpayers don't have to subsidize a pension for someone who has broken the law or broken a serious rule during their time in office.
There are some provisions in the current statute that do allow for the removal of that provision. Bribery, treason, espionage, those are pretty clear. What gaps does your bill try to address specifically?
Right. We're adding sexual assault and serious violent crimes, things that should be, part of that list that are very serious crimes, but somehow haven't made their way onto it. And we're also adding sexual misconduct with a staffer who reports to you, which is a very clear violation of our rules. Very serious. I mean, you're putting a staffer in a very hard situation. And so, we thought this was common sense to add these, and that, in two recent examples where those offenses happened and the members decided to resign, if that had no bearing on whether they collect a pension. I think it should moving forward.
So would you say moving forward that the current provisions around requiring a criminal conviction to remove the pension would be added by a misconduct charge? People could resign under the misconduct charge without a criminal conviction?
So even, let's say someone has served long enough to collect a pension, and then they commit a very serious crime and decide that they want to eschew the ethics committee, which I serve on, and simply retire. If they get convicted of that crime later on, then they are no longer eligible for a pension. And so this ensures that, one, they have due process. And so just being accused of a crime isn't enough to lose your pension. But when you're convicted of it, or when there's very clear evidence that you broke a serious rule, like having an affair with a staffer, for instance, then you will no longer be eligible for a pension. The idea is to make clear that we're no way going to reward misconduct or very serious crimes committed during their time in office.
Do you see this reform primarily as about deterrence, changing behavior, or really more a public messaging about how Congress governs itself?
I see it as all of the above. Certainly, the best deterrence for anyone is hitting their pocketbooks. In Congress, we cannot put people in jail. We do not do that. We, make the laws, but the worst the worst punishment someone can receive as a member of Congress from the ethics committee where I serve is being expelled from Congress. We can do no more than that. This is taking it one step further. I do think by passing laws like this, we show the American public that we are serious about policing ourselves, and that this is not about trying to protect each other and trying to look out for each other in Congress. This is about looking out for the American people and their tax dollars and making sure that members of Congress are held to a high standard.
Congressman Suhas Subramaniam represents Virginia's 10th congressional district. So you've framed this as a matter of accountability. The FERS retirement system that average federal workers use is the same that members of Congress pay into and that this pension would be paid out of. From your perspective, should congressional retirement benefits line up with the expectations that lawmakers place on the rest of the federal workforce?
I think members of Congress should be held to a higher standard than the average citizen. We are elected by the people, and they put their trust in us and their taxpayer dollars behind us. And we're a reflection of their communities and are supposed to uphold the values of those communities when we come to Congress. And when we come here, we disagree on a lot of issues because of that. But we're supposed to set an example. And that idea of setting an example for the American people is bipartisan. I don't think anyone disagrees here in the body. But if we're continuing to see misconduct and very serious crimes being committed by members while in office, it reflects on all members, and it certainly reflects on their communities, and it is an embarrassment to their communities and to the American people. So that's why we want to hold members of Congress to a higher standard.
And is it the rash of recent headlines that prompted you and your colleagues to introduce this bill today or now?
That was certainly part of it. I certainly learned recently about this pension system and what is and isn't disqualifying. And as a member of the Ethics Committee, I always wondered, why are people resigning before they face judgment from the Ethics Committee? And while that has nothing to do with the pension, it certainly has something to do with the idea that they don't want to face consequences or see more evidence come out about other wrongdoing that may have happened. So they want us to stop the investigation. And one way to do that is to resign, because we can no longer investigate them once they resign.
So what is the next step for your bill?
So there's two options. One, we can push it through committee, which is the easier option. I don't think this should be controversial, but sometimes committees tend to sit on bills. They don't want to move bills forward. So, that's one idea. It's important to note that this bill in particular would not apply to this Congress. It would only apply starting in the next Congress, because we're not allowed to change the rules governing things like our pension for our Congress. So it would apply to the next Congress. So we have some time between now and December to try to pass this bill. If the committee sits on it and doesn't want to act on it, the speaker doesn't want to act on it, another thing we could do is try to bring it to the floor through a discharge petition or some other mechanism. And given that we have several Republicans who support the bill already, and we have almost all, if not all, Democrats who I think would be supportive, we could get this to the floor if the committees and the speaker do not want it on the floor. I think if you put it to a vote in Congress right now, you wouldn't see many people vote against it.
And do you believe that you'd get a similar level of support on the Senate side?
We are in discussions with some senators on introducing a companion bill, either to this or maybe a bigger bill that encompasses this. And so we believe that there is support already in the Senate, and we hope that the Senate will introduce either similar or the same legislation. But right now, those talks are happening.
Are there other ethics areas that you and the Oversight Committee are considering exploring?
Well, I sit on the Oversight Committee and the Ethics Committee, which are separate. And the Ethics Committee in particular has been criticized in recent months for being slow. And it's funny because this has actually been the most efficient Ethics Committee in modern congressional history. We've closed out several matters that have been pending since before COVID. COVID really set the Ethics Committee back. We've closed many matters that were outstanding for a long time, and we have moved very fast on a record number of investigations that we have this year. The Ethics Committee used to be, at one point in Congress, simply a place where complaints went to die, and we're trying to change that perception now and take every complaint seriously and investigate it thoroughly. We do still want due process for all complaints and all members, and sometimes that means we do not move as fast as the news cycle, but we move faster than a court of law. I've worked with my colleagues to develop a few tactics to help get things moving quickly. And we have a set of reforms that I've explored and I've talked to my colleagues about that we hope to enact, if not this Congress, then the next Congress.
Congressman Suhas Subramaniam represents Virginia's 10th Congressional District. Sir, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, a vote doesn't always bring closure on Capitol Hill. Why some of Congress's biggest fights don't really end when the gavel comes down. But first, in government, offering your best professional advice doesn't guarantee it will be taken, or that raising concerns will be consequence-free. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Federal News Network has been reporting on the fallout from EPA's decision to discipline employees who signed a declaration of dissent. Now we're turning to how that call was made, despite internal warnings about legal risk. It highlights a familiar tension across government. What happens to career expertise when agency leaders choose another path? Here to discuss his reporting on this issue is Kevin Bogardus from E&E News. Kevin, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
You've been reporting on a story that started actually last July with the EPA Declaration of Dissent. Can you refresh us for a minute on what started this whole conversation?
So essentially last summer, a group of EPA employees, dozens of EPA employees got together and they signed a letter that essentially was an open dissent letter and was very critical of the Trump administration, especially of its treatment of science as well as the staff at the agency. Stand Up for Science, a nonprofit group, had helped organize the letter. They've helped organize similar letters at other science and public health agencies like EPA. And essentially that letter came out, I believe it came out the morning of June 30th last year, and got a lot of coverage from national news outlets across the country, really drew a big spot, put a big spotlight on EPA and what was going on in the agency during the second Trump administration. Later that week, July 3rd, about the day before, right before the 4th of July holiday, EPA released a statement and also sent notices to various employees that it put, close to 150 EPA employees who had signed the dissent letter on administrative leave. And there was a very harsh statement that came from Administrator Lee Zeldin, the head of the agency. Essentially, my reporting kind of fills in what was happening during that week from the Monday the letter was released to the Thursday where the administrative leave began. And just to kind of finish what happened, these employees ended up being on administrative leave for weeks, essentially to the end of August. And then the agency started sending notices, I should say, to certain EPA employees that you've been proposed for removal or you've been terminated. Essentially, both of those you're fired. And many more were given notice that they would be suspended without pay for 2 weeks. And that essentially was the discipline meted out to these employees who signed the dissent letter. Essentially, my reporting, though, is in that week between the letter came out and before that first kind of response from the agency by putting these employees on administrative leave. And that was essentially there was an email from an assistant general counsel, a top lawyer in the employment law practice group at EPA, so an EPA lawyer, who just said his legal advice to the agency was not to take, quote, personnel actions, end quote, or make any move that could be considered, quote, retaliatory, end quote, or have a chilling effect, again, quote, have a chilling effect, end quote, on other staff. That email was sent to his colleagues, essentially on the human resources staff at EPA on July 2nd. So that's the day before for kind of the first response from EPA where these employees were placed on administrative leave. And so that was sent out. And I also was able to obtain a copy of kind of a chain of emails where that eventually reached some very top political appointees of the Trump administration who work at EPA, I think with the guidance of, quote, for situational awareness, end quote. So it seems that they were very much aware of this warning, this caution about taking action against EPA employees. And then on top of that, there was also a finding from the EPA ethics office that they didn't see any ethics concern with EPA employees signing the dissent letter. And essentially that was shared with other senior officials at EPA as well. So essentially you had two kind of instances of legal advice or advice from various lawyers within the agency that there wasn't an issue with the dissent letter and even that you should not take action against them. Going back to the employment law lawyer at EPA, he cited a Supreme Court decision from almost 60 years ago called Pickering versus Board Education, it does say the government has an interest in regulating its employees' speech, federal employees' speech, but that ruling established, quote, a balancing test, end quote, to protect First Amendments of those federal workers, which is if the workers speak as private citizens about, quote, a matter of public concern, end quote, it doesn't interfere with their government jobs. And in one instance, at least in one part of the dissent letter, they make it very well known that they created and signed and sent the letter during their own personal time and their own personal capacity, and they didn't use government resources to craft or send the letter. And there was a subsequent investigation by EPA. We don't really know what that investigation found, but it did seem they were trying to ascertain whether the EPA employees did use government resources to view or sign the letter. So that's kind of where we're at now. This is now being challenged, at least before the Merit Systems Protection Board. The group of EPA employees who were fired after they signed the letter ended up taking their case. They're being represented by a few law firms as well as public employees for environmental responsibility, kind of a watchdog group for federal employees at energy and environmental agencies. And they've taken their case to the Merit Systems Protection Board. And my understanding, that case is still ongoing. And of course, there's been a lot of complaints filed at MSPB during the second Trump administration. So it'll be interesting to see when we get resolution on that.
I'm speaking with Kevin Bogardus. He's a reporter for E&E News. Kevin, I really appreciate you walking us through the whole history there. It seems like a classic case of career professionals giving their best professional advice, the attorney, the ethics office, and agency political leaders deciding not to do what they've advised. Would you say that's because the political leadership did a risk analysis here, or they had a political agenda? Have you been able to uncover sort of the motivation behind the decision?
It's been difficult. I would not say I've been able to uncover the motivation by political leadership to take action. They essentially have said, since this episode began last summer, they've essentially said, we have a zero tolerance policy for anyone within the agency undermining or sabotaging or undercutting the agenda of this administration that was elected to office, back in November 2024. Of course, was then sworn in January 2025. So they've essentially, that's what they've been saying publicly. They also say they don't comment on individual employees' cases. And that is something, we'll continue to press on. But, hopefully we can get some more answers on why exactly this went down the way it went down as these cases proceed.
Since you've been reporting on this, what have you heard from other EPA employees about whether that chilling effect that the lawyers warned about is actually taking place? Are employees thinking differently about how they speak up or what they say?
I think that's a fair assessment. I do think EPA employees perceived, when these people who signed the dissent letter were put on administrative leave, and then of course when some of them were fired and many were suspended without pay for 2 weeks. I mean, that grabbed definitely the attention of other people who are working at the agency. It does frighten. What I've been told is that that they are frightened. They are worried about losing their jobs if they are critical, and especially are critical publicly of this administration. So that's something I've heard over and over again, even before the dissent letter. But the dissent letter, this episode really emphasized that there is this worry and caution about speaking up within the agency, and essentially, they did see consequences for that for their colleagues who decided to sign this open dissent letter that, was sent to the administrator, but also was sent to Congress and released publicly as well.
This was, as you said, one of a few letters of dissent that came out at about the same point in the first year of the Trump administration. For federal employees who might be watching this from outside the EPA, Do you see it setting a precedent potentially for how dissent is treated within the agencies? Is that practice continuing still?
I think, I haven't covered the other dissent letters as closely as I have covered the EPA dissent letter. But my understanding is there definitely was a response against employees at FEMA who signed a similar dissent letter. Essentially, I think they were placed on administrative leave, and I think some were fired as well. You'd have to check me on that. I know there were similar letters, I believe, in National Institutes, of Health, NIH, and I think there was one at the National Science Foundation too. So it just, this has become an avenue for federal employees who are critical of the administration, how they've treated the government workforce, how they've, applied science and so forth, a way for them to be critical of the administration, but also it's an agenda to response back from the administration, which has led, especially to EPA, for some people to be fired as well as suspended without pay for about 2 weeks. So there definitely was kind of been this back and forth, and EPA was just one of the agencies where this happened.
And the litigation is still ongoing. What are you hearing from lawyers kind of about the merits of the case? Is this going to establish some new precedent?
I think, again, it's kind of when it goes to the Merit Systems Protection Board, it kind of very much goes into a black box. I think we'll get a decision, and I hope that'll be released publicly. I don't know when that will be coming. I definitely think lawyers for the EPA employees are trying to establish that not only was this signing this letter and sending it out was in their free speech rights, but also that they were acting as whistleblowers and raising, kind of issues of public concern of how things were operating at the agency. So it's kind of, I know that's kind of the approach from the lawyers who are representing the EPA employees who've been fired because of signing this dissent letter. I'm not sure how the agency has or will respond to that. But, it'll be interesting how that turns out and how the board rules on it. And if we do get a precedent on kind of whistleblowing and dissent and open criticism by federal employees of their government employers.
I've been speaking with Kevin Bogardus. He's a reporter for E&E News. Kevin, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, a vote doesn't always bring closure on Capitol Hill. Why some of Congress's biggest fights don't really end when the gavel comes down. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. In Washington, a vote doesn't always mean resolution. In some of the biggest congressional fights, decisions can leave everyone bruised, with new conflicts already taking shape. WTOP's Capitol Hill correspondent, Mitchell Miller, joins us with a look at what Congress has settled and what it hasn't. Mitchell, thank you so much for joining me today.
Absolutely.
I feel like we should wipe our brow and go, phew, finally, we have DHS funding after 76 days of a lapse. But it doesn't feel like a very good resolution. First of all, we're going to have to do this again in 5 months. But tell us how the final deal all came together.
Well, this was really extraordinary, even by congressional standards. I have to say, I have never seen anything quite like this. I mean, if you look back 35 days before the House actually approved this voice vote on the DHS bill to end the partial government shutdown, the Senate had approved the same bill by a voice vote itself. And of course, House Speaker Mike Johnson at the time called it a joke. He was trying to get back with his conservative members of the House and say, look, we're gonna do this on our own. But ultimately, as the weeks went on, the Senate and Senate Majority Leader John Thune, who is a pretty cool customer, was making it increasingly clear that he was getting tired of the fact that the House had said, well, we're just not going to deal with it, even though the Senate passed this bill. And the House continued to talk about ICE and the fact that the border protection needed to be separated, which the Senate agreed with. So essentially what you had after 76 days is something that was there all along. And that's not just criticism from Democrats. Some Republicans were saying that too. Now, the House Speaker tried to say, well, we had to separate these two other agencies, and there were a lot of other concerns that we had to deal with. But it was really remarkable to me that this held on for so long without getting resolved. The fact that when you look at it, really, everybody tries to say who are the winners and losers in this, right? So, of course, both parties are going to point fingers at the others saying that they are the losers. But really, I think the losers in all of this are the tens of thousands of federal employees who went without pay during this shutdown, as well as the American people who rely on the services that they provide. These people were just literally hung out to dry for a long time. And the only reason they got paid over the last several weeks, as you know, is because the administration shifted some funds to allow them to get paid. So I think a couple of things that caused it to end were, one, the White House finally got a little bit more involved, and President Trump said he really wanted to get this done. And then also the Department of Homeland Security and the new secretary, Mark Wayne Mullen, said, look, we're going to run out of money in the next few days if this isn't taken care of. So I think a lot of factors there went into this, but certainly not a real great moment here in Congress.
You're right, Mitchell. There are organizations in DHS that are sort of way behind the eight ball in terms of their own operations, and many affect national security. So it's difficult to pick a winner here. But how does this get back to the party's political arguments that were at the core of this around reforms to Customs and Border Protection and ICE?
Well, that's the really interesting thing. I mean, if you look at it objectively, Democrats essentially started this standoff. They said that because of the fatal shootings in connection with border enforcement, that they had to have some reforms within ICE. And they held out for that for a very long time. And they still are pressing for those reforms with masks, cameras, new guidelines, et cetera. Republicans are saying, okay, you pushed this into a shutdown and then you got nothing for it. Really, there have been no major reforms. There's a couple of minor reforms that were included in the original legislation, but the Democrats really didn't get what they wanted, other than they were able to say to their base, we did fight for this. On the Republican side, they can say that, one, that they can point the finger at the Democrats for starting it, but then also they have to get back to some kind of normality, because right now the House and the Senate are just going back and forth at each other in connection with these bills. So I think what's going to happen is Republicans are clearly going to have to get on the same page, because they're going to go through reconciliation and they are going to get the money, this $70 billion that they're hoping to approve for about 3 years of funding for ICE and for border protection. But there are some other issues rippling there already that we'll talk about more in the future.
Mitchell Miller is Capitol Hill correspondent for WTOP. Mitchell, we alluded to the national security impacts of this standoff that's been going on. Let's shift to another aspect of that. The Defense Secretary was on the Hill last week talking to both the Senate and the House about the war in Iran. What did you hear there?
Well, this was a really feisty series of hearings. The House and the Senate Armed Services Committees both pressing the Secretary over and over again about what is the end game, where are we going with this, questions about what has actually happened with the nuclear program in Iran. And the Defense Secretary Hegseth really digging in and saying, look, we've done everything that the president wanted us to do. Why aren't you supporting us? He, from his standpoint, he feels that they are getting undercut by not only Democrats, but many Republicans who are at this point, now that we're past the 60 days for the War Powers Act, that even some GOP lawmakers are saying, well, wait a second, now Congress needs to really weigh in on this. We have to see what's going on here. However, there's been some interesting language twisting involving the administration and Defense Secretary Hegseth. They're essentially saying, no, this 60 days is not actually up because there's been a ceasefire in effect for several weeks. So they say that stops the calendar. However, lawmakers just really aren't buying that argument. argument. In fact, late last week, the administration even said that the war has been terminated. So there is only going to be, I think, more and more discussion of all of these attendant issues, especially with the fact that the Strait of Hormuz remains a huge issue, and you still have these gas prices and oil prices fluctuating wildly and now going up and up and up again. So this is not something that the administration can just say, well, there's a ceasefire and it's all over right now.
Right. And both sides are talking about bringing up war powers votes or authorizations for the use of military force. Do you see any of that getting traction now that we are past this 60-day mark?
You know, several weeks ago, I didn't think it was getting much traction, but now, as we have talked about in the past with this 60-day marker, I think it is getting traction. You had Alaska Senator Lisa Murkowski late last week talking about the fact that they needed to do something now that we're in that 60-day period. You had the fact that Maine Republican Susan Collins, for the first time other than Rand Paul, was a Republican who voted with Democrats on the war powers resolution, even though it failed. And Democrats are going to continue to bring that up when lawmakers return. So I think you're just only going to see more and more discussion about Congress getting more involved on this issue.
The other aspect of national security that's been in conversation on the Hill is the FISA bill. It looks like that may finally be moving.
Yes, it's interesting to see how the FISA bill has worked, especially that Section 702, which, you know, has been a big controversy, especially in the House. It's interesting that some of the lawmakers in the House have changed their views. For example, the Judiciary Chair, Jim Jordan, the last time Section 702 came up, he was a fierce opponent of getting it approved. This time he was on the floor saying it needed to be approved. So then the House got it through, to House Speaker Mike Johnson's credit, given all the different things that are going on with his very slim majority. They got it through for a 3-year extension. However, the Senate had said, no, this is dead on arrival because of a few things, including the fact that it would bar the Federal Reserve from establishing a central bank digital currency, which is a whole nother issue. But as you know, sometimes these side issues distract from what's happening with the overall bill. So the Senate then approves this 45-day extension to try to give them some more time yet again. But I think what we're seeing here is a pattern with the House, you know, with Speaker Johnson having so many difficulties trying to get anything through. He just wants to get it done. So he passes it off and then says, okay, Senate, you deal with it. And the majority leader on the Senate side, John Thune, as I mentioned, doesn't like to deal with that in that way. So there is some inherent tension there, and that's something that they are going to have to deal with in the coming months.
Both chambers are on recess this week. Are they really on recess? Are they trying to diffuse some of this tension? Are they really trying to do some work behind the scenes?
I think that they are, frankly, quite relieved to get out. You know, sometimes we talk about the fact that the anger and all the angst comes bubbling up here in Congress, and sometimes Congress just really needs to leave. A lot of people, of course, say they leave too often because it seems like they're on break every few weeks. But I think, you know, behind the scenes, there are markups on the positive side taking place that are going to be taking place in the coming weeks when they return. I mean, if you look at the schedule, I was looking at the House Appropriations schedule. They have a series of markups on all the bills that you would think of with commerce, justice, the legislative branch bill. So even though the DHS shutdown has, of course, dominated all of our attention, the good news is behind the scenes, the staffers that do this kind of work, they are trying to set things up so that they can hopefully get back to a little bit more normalcy when they return here. But of course, as we've talked about, that is also complicated by this little fact that the midterm elections are coming up later this year. So I think they're probably more focused on that right now than what some of the staffers are working on behind the scenes, trying to get the legislative wheels moving.
It's Mitchell Miller, Capitol Hill correspondent for WTOP. Mitchell, I always appreciate your inside perspective on this.
Thank you very much.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. The Space Force is getting ready to bring part-timers into its force as it continues to build a personnel model radically different from the other services. Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis is here with more detail. Anastasia, thank you for joining me.
Hi, Terry.
This seems like a very different approach. What exactly is the Space Force doing here?
Oh, yeah, definitely. So the service recently announced it has selected about 250 Air Force reservists who work in space-related fields to transfer in a part-time capacity into the Space Force. So the Space Force is the newest military branch of them, as we know, and they've been trying to figure out how to best manage their force since the service's creation in 2019. In 2024, former President Joe Biden signed the Space Force Personnel Management Act into law as part of that year's defense policy bill. And that allowed the Space Force to abandon this kind of traditional component structure, which includes active duty and reserve components, and create one unified personnel system. So no guard, no reserve. It's one system that blends full-time and part-time people. The idea here is to kind of build a model that is in step with the needs of modern guardians. It would improve, or it's supposed to improve recruiting. It's also supposed to help the Space Force attract top talent if they offer this type of flexibility to its personnel, and it would also help retention and kind of keeping service members in uniform longer instead of, let's say, you have kind of a life-changing event, whether you're a parent or you're caring for a parent. So this types of arrangement allows you for more flexibility, and the service can technically accommodate that.
The talking points sound good, but how would it actually work?
Yeah, so these part-timers will be known as guardians on non-station duty. According to the Space Force, part-timers will work mainly in test and evaluation, training, support and education, and headquarters staff roles. Last year, the service kind of laid out how it envisions it or how exactly this would work. And it looks like these opportunities, they said, would be episodic, so they're not supposed to last for years. Part-timers are required to complete at least 36 days of service each year to have a good year toward retirement, but the number of days part-timers will be expected to work will depend on their role. They could work Monday through Friday. They could work on weekends. Again, it will all depend on their role. However, one caveat is that commanders will review these positions annually to decide if they're still eligible for part-time service. So we'll see how it will actually play out in practice. Because let's say, so these part-time officers must commit to at least 3 years of service, and enlisted personnel will have to commit to 3 years to 6 years of service if they decide to transfer into the Space Force as part-timers. So for Air Force reservists, for instance, who move into these roles, they might have this expectation that they're able to stay in the role, in this part-time role for a while. But that could change because commanders could review the role and decide that it's not a part-time role anymore. But Air Force reservists with 15 to 18 years of qualifying service who transfer into the Space Force will be allowed to stay in this part-time role until they qualify for retirement.
So what will happen next? How does this get off the paper and into practice?
So the Space Force has been doing this in phases. The initial phase was completed in 2025, and that phase was focused on moving Air Force reservists into full-time roles within the Space Force. Then, 6 months ago, the service opened applications for part-time positions. So, as I mentioned, they selected these 250 people, and if they agree to transfer, they will officially begin that move this summer. The idea is that over time, the Air Force Reserve, Guard, and the Air Force itself will not have space operations as a career field. Reservists working in space-related career fields will have to retrain if they decide that they don't want to move into the Space Force. And in the meantime, the Space Force has also been trying to figure out how to integrate these part-timers into its ranks, how to manage their pay, benefits, retirement, VA eligibility, etc. So, for instance, the service relies on the Air Force's HR systems. They're outdated. They're not suited for the service's needs. So Congress gave the Space Force 5 years to complete this transition and to implement this new model. And the Space Force has been focusing on building this modern IT ecosystem to support this really fundamentally different approach to how they manage talent.
There was some discussion about creating a Space National Guard. Where does this project leave that discussion?
Yeah, this has been a hot button issue in the community for a while. And President Donald Trump, when he was running, he promised to create a dedicated Space National Guard. It is, however, been an unpopular idea among DoD leadership and the White House. But governors of states with Air National Guard space units, they would say there were a couple of things. They would say that there was no formal notification, coordination with, or consent obtained from the impacted states. The fight was happening for a long time, and it's over whether Air National Guard space units can be moved into the active duty Space Force without obtaining approval from state governors as required by law. And so governors would say, look, it's unclear how this would impact their states if they lose this talent. But at the same time, Air Guard members were able to apply for full-time positions within the Space Force, or they had an option of retraining and moving into different positions. One more thing that I will add to that, when I was covering, as this fight was unfolding and I was covering it, the majority of Air National Guard personnel said that they would rather retrain into other roles than move into the Space Force.
That's Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Anastasia, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Terry.
The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.